When hell tears Manhattan open, the Avengers barely hold the line. Doctor Strange realizes the invasion isn't random. It's a contract written in blood, claiming the city one soul at a time. Then something else arrives. Silent, armored, unstoppable. The Doomslayer doesn't negotiate with demons. But when Mephisto and Dormammu both move to claim Manhattan, even a warrior built to kill hell itself faces impossible odds. Destroy the anchor and risk collapse, or let the city burn. Some wars don't end. They just find new hells. Rain came down in sheets over midtown Manhattan, turning the streets into mirrors of neon and headlights. It was the kind of winter night where the city folded in on itself, where even the most hardened New Yorkers hurried home with their collars up and their heads down. The subway rumbled beneath the pavement. Taxis honked. Steam rose from grates in the sidewalk. Then the ground screamed. The asphalt buckled in the intersection of 42nd and 7th concrete, folding like paper. The sound was wrong, not an explosion, not a collapse, but something organic, something breathing. A fissure tore across the street 20 feet wide, and growing edges glowing with a light that didn't belong to any spectrum the human eye was meant to see. Red-black like infected flesh lit from within. The temperature spiked. Car alarms shrieked. Windows shattered in waves, cascading glass across the sidewalks. People screamed and ran, but the fissure was already spreading, crawling up the sides of buildings like a vine made of fire and ruin. Something crawled out. It had too many limbs. Its skin was the color of charcoal and wet meat. When it opened its mouth, the sound was metal scraping bone. 3 more followed, then a dozen. They moved with purpose, fanning out across the street, claws gouging divots in the pavement. The city's emergency systems kicked in. Police sirens converged from every direction. FDNY units rolled in with lights blazing. But when the first responders arrived, their radios crackled with static. Their equipment readings spiked into nonsense. One officer raised his sidearm. The demon turned its head. He fired. The bullet struck center mass and tumbled to the ground, flattened, smoking. "Fall back!" The sergeant's voice was hoarse. "Fall back and establish a perimeter." But the fissure kept growing. The Avengers arrived within minutes. Captain America hit the ground running, shield already raised. He took in the chaos with a single sweep of his eyes. Civilians trapped in overturned cars, a tour bus teetering on the edge of the fissure, smoke pouring from the subway entrance. He barked orders into his comms. "Tony, I need barriers on the west side. Thor, clear the air and hold that line. Everyone else focus on evacuation." Iron Man's repulsors lit the sky as he descended, armor gleaming wet in the rain. "Jarvis, what am I looking at?" "Energy readings are inconsistent, sir. The fissure is generating a localized distortion field. Scans are inconclusive." Of course they are. Tony deployed a row of energy barriers along the perimeter, drones fanning out to scan for survivors. "Cap, we've got structural integrity failing on the east block. Buildings 2 and 4 are compromised." "Noted." Steve's voice was clipped-focused. He vaulted over a wrecked taxi and hauled a woman out of a shattered storefront. "Get to the marked zone. Move." Thunder cracked overhead. Thor descended in a blaze of lightning, Mjolnir singing through the rain. His eyes blazed with stormlight as he took in the scene. "This reeks of sorcery. Dark sorcery." He raised his hammer and brought it down. The resulting shockwave flattened a cluster of demons surging toward a huddled group of paramedics. "The creatures are endless. Where is their source?" "The fissure," Tony said. "And it's not closing." Steve gritted his teeth. They were holding the line, but barely. Every demon they put down was replaced by two more. The fissure pulsed like a heartbeat, each throb sending another wave of heat and wrongness into the air. He could see it now. Faint lines of script etched into the edges of the tear, glowing symbols that shifted and writhed. This wasn't an invasion. It was something worse. Then, Dr. Strange arrived in a shimmer of golden light, the cloak of levitation billowing behind him as he materialized on a rooftop overlooking the chaos. Wong stood at his side, already tracing sigils in the air. Strange's eyes narrowed as he studied the fissure. "This isn't a breach," he said quietly. Wong glanced at him. "Then what is it?" "A contract." Strange extended one hand, fingers moving in precise patterns. The eye of Agamotto flared, and the world slowed. Through the lens of his magic, he could see the true threads of infernal energy woven through the fissure like stitches in a wound, each one anchored to the city itself. The demons weren't invading. They were claiming. "They're binding the city," Strange said. His voice was tight. "Every step they take, every building they touch, it's like they're signing Manhattan into a lease agreement with hell." Wong's expression darkened. "Can we sever it?" "Not from here." Strange closed his hand and the vision faded. "We need to cut the source, but that means going down there." Below, the ground shook. A new sound rose from the fissure, deep, resonant, like a horn blown in some abyssal cathedral. The demons froze for a single moment, heads tilted as if listening. Then they scattered, moving with sudden coordination. Something else was coming. The warped titan crawled out of the fissure like a tumor emerging from diseased flesh. It was 30 feet tall, all muscle and bone and iron spikes, skin cracked and glowing from within. Its eyes were hollow pits filled with ember light. When it took its first step, the ground buckled. When it took its second, a subway tunnel collapsed beneath it, sending a plume of dust and debris into the air. Captain America's shield bounced off its chest and clattered to the ground. "Okay," Tony said, voice strained. "That's new." Thor hurled Mjolnir. The hammer struck the Titan square in the skull with a sound like a gong. The creature staggered, then straightened. It opened its mouth and roared a sound that made the rain boil in midair. Thor caught Mjolnir on the return and grimaced. "This will take more than brute force." Strange descended, cloak billowing. He traced a circle in the air, and barriers of golden light materialized around the Titan, bands of mystic energy cinching tight. The Titan strained. The barriers held for 5 seconds. Then they shattered, and the backlash sent Strange skidding backward across the wet pavement. He caught himself breathing hard. The Titan raised one massive foot and brought it down. The sealing ward Strange had placed at the fissure's edge cracked like ice. "Fall back!" Captain America's voice rang out over the chaos. "Evacuate the next 3 blocks now." The Titan advanced. Behind it, the fissure widened. More demons poured through a tide of claws and teeth and wrongness. The Avengers fought, but the line was breaking. The city was breaking. And somewhere far below the surface, deeper than any subway tunnel or sewer line, something ancient and malevolent stirred. It felt the breach. It felt the wards weakening. It felt opportunity. Deep in the dark, something began to pulse. Not a heart, a machine. A hook sunk into the city's foundation, pulling it towards something worse. Dr. Strange stood in the rain, arcane light flickering around his hands as he prepared another spell. He could feel it now, the shape of the trap closing around them. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. Calculated. Someone had opened a door, and they weren't planning to close it. The Titan roared again, and the rain turned to steam. The Sanctum Sanctorum had become a war room. Wong worked methodically, chalk dust coating his fingers as he traced containment wards across the hardwood floor. Candles burned at precise intervals, their flames bending toward the center of the pattern without wind. Outside, the city trembled. Inside, Dr. Strange stood before a scrying mirror, watching the chaos unfold in Midtown. The warped Titan was tearing through buildings like they were cardboard. The Avengers were holding the evacuation perimeter, but barely. Every minute that passed, the fissure grew wider. The binding thread sank deeper into the city's foundation. Strange's jaw tightened. He'd seen dimensional breaches before. This was something worse. The demons weren't invading. They were claiming ownership. Every step they took etched another clause into an invisible contract written in blood and fire. "We need to cut the anchor," Strange said. His voice was steady, but his hands moved in tight, precise gestures, pulling threads of information from the Vishanti's archives. "The source isn't here. It's below. Deep below." Wong didn't look up from his work. "Then we go down. You'll need someone to hold the wards while you work." Wong finished the last sigil and straightened. "Unless you'd prefer to do this alone." Strange allowed himself a tight smile. "I would not." He raised both hands. Golden light spiraled outward, and the air in the center of the room began to tear. Not violently, this was surgical. A doorway to hell required precision, or the door would become a dam break. Strange murmured the incantation, feeling resistance push back against him. Whatever had opened the fissure didn't want visitors going the other direction. He pushed harder. The spell almost completed. Then Strange felt it, a pulse of energy from somewhere far beyond Earth, far beyond dimensions he recognized. It wasn't hellfire or demonic. It was something colder. Something that didn't belong in any framework he'd studied. It was coming here. Strange's eyes widened. "Wong, we need to..." The roof exploded. The impact shook the sanctum to its foundations. Dust and debris rained down. Wong threw up a barrier, instinctively golden shields catching chunks of ceiling before they could crush the ritual space. Strange's cloak snapped out, yanking him back as a section of wall collapsed where he'd been standing. Something landed in the courtyard outside. Strange moved to the shattered window cloak, billowing. Through the smoke and rain, he could see a figure rising to its feet. Armor. Green-scarred, covered in burns that looked decades old. A helmet with no visible eyes, just a dark visor reflecting nothing. The figure didn't stumble, didn't look around. It simply stood, and the rain steamed off its shoulders. "What is that?" Wong's voice was quiet. Strange didn't answer. He was too busy watching the way reality bent around the armored figure, not breaking, but recoiling. As if the universe itself recognized a foreign object and didn't know how to process it. The figure turned its head toward the fissure miles away, but visible as a column of red-black light stabbing into the sky. Then it started walking, directly toward it. Strange's hand moved. A portal opened in front of the figure. "Stop!" The figure didn't stop. It walked through the portal, emerged on the other side, and kept going. Strange frowned. He gestured again. Bands of golden light materialized around the figure's limbs, the crimson bands of Sitorak locking tight. The figure paused. For 1 second, Strange thought it had worked. Then the figure moved. The bands strained. Strange felt it, a wrongness in the weave, like reality itself flinching away from whatever was inside that armor. The bands cracked, shattered. "That's not possible," Wong said. The figure reached its back and drew a weapon, some kind of shotgun, oversized, brutal. It racked the slide with one hand and aimed at the sanctum's gate. Strange stepped forward, hands raised. "I don't know what you are, but if you're planning to interfere..." The figure fired. Not at Strange, at a demon that had been crawling up the sanctum's outer wall. Claws already gouging into the stone, the blast vaporized it. The figure reloaded and kept walking toward the street, toward the fissure. Strange stared. Then, understanding clicked. "It's not here to interfere," he said quietly. "It's here to kill them." And Captain America saw it first. A shape moving through the smoke, cutting across the evacuation route with mechanical precision. Steve raised his shield, stepping into the path. "Civilian, you need to fall back to the safe zone. This area is..." The figure walked past him. Steve's hand shot out, catching the armored shoulder. "I said stop!" The helmet turned. No expression, no acknowledgement. Just a single glance, as if measuring whether Steve was a threat or an obstacle. Then it shrugged off his grip and kept moving. "Okay." Steve's voice hardened. "That's not how this works." He moved to intercept again. This time the figure stopped. It looked at Steve's shield, then at the fissure, then back at Steve. The message was clear. "You're wasting my time." Tony's voice crackled through the comms. "Cap, I'm seeing an unknown on your position. Armor signature is weird. Really weird. Weird how, like it shouldn't exist, weird. Jarvis can't classify it. No tech signature, no energy source, but it's moving like Cap. Is it carrying a shotgun?" Steve didn't answer. The figure had already turned away and was walking toward the fissure again. A cluster of demons surged out of an alley, shrieking. The figure didn't slow. It raised the shotgun and fired. 1, 2, 3. Each shot was a kill. No wasted movement, no hesitation. "Tony," Steve said slowly, "I think we might have a freelancer." "Great. Does this freelancer take orders?" Steve watched the figure reload, mid-stride shell casings scattering across the wet pavement. "I'm going to say no." The bus teetered on the edge of the fissure rear wheels, hanging over empty air. Inside, a driver and 6 passengers clung to the seats, too terrified to move. The frame groaned. Metal twisted. The armored figure appeared at the edge of the crater. It assessed the situation in a single glance. The bus was blocking the direct line to the fissure. The most efficient solution was to remove the obstacle. It gripped the bus's rear bumper and pulled. The vehicle lurched backward, tires screeching as it was dragged away from the edge. The figure let go, and the bus slumped onto solid ground. The driver stared out the window, wide-eyed. The figure was already moving past toward the fissure. The survivors were incidental. Captain America lowered his shield slightly. He'd been ready to intervene, ready to stop what looked like a potential casualty. But the armored figure had just saved 6 lives without breaking stride. Not out of heroism, just efficiency. "Hold position," Steve said into the comms. "Let it through." "Cap, are you sure? It's not here to hurt anyone." Steve's voice was firm. "It's here for them." The figure reached the fissure's edge. Demons surged forward, claws extended. The figure drew a blade, glowing red energy crackling along its length, and stepped into the horde. The slaughter was clinical. The attack on the sanctum came at dawn. Strange had been preparing the gateway, laying the final wards that would allow safe passage into Hell's upper layers. He needed to reach the infernal anchor, needed to sever the binding contract before it became permanent. The armored figure had drawn the demon's attention, which bought time. But time was running out. Then, the sanctum's outer wards flared. Incoming. Strange spun cloak already billowing. A wave of lesser demons crashed against the sanctum's walls, claws scrabbling for purchase. They weren't strong, but there were dozens. Hundreds. They poured through the streets like a flood drawn to the concentration of mystic energy. Wong moved to the balcony hands, weaving defensive barriers. They're trying to collapse the wards. Then we hold. Strange's hands blurred through a sequence of gestures, and the sanctum's ancient defenses roared to life. Sigils burned along the walls. The air thickened with protective enchantments. It wouldn't be enough. Then the armored figure appeared in the courtyard below. Strange watched from above as the figure surveyed the approaching horde. No fear, no hesitation. It simply reloaded its weapon, checked the blade on its back, and walked forward to meet them. The sanctum's main hallway became a kill zone. The demons funneled through the entrance, and the figure turned the narrow space into a grinder. Shotgun blasts echoed off stone walls. The energy blade carved through chitin and bone. Every movement was economical. Every shot was a kill. The figure didn't retreat, didn't dodge unless necessary. It simply advanced step by step, turning the hallway into a corridor of corpses. Strange descended the stairs, prepared to assist. But assistance wasn't needed. The figure fought like a force of nature. No, not nature. Nature had randomness. This was precision. This was a machine built for a single purpose, executing its function without deviation. When the last demon fell, the figure stood in the center of the carnage armor, slick with ichor. Then it paused. Head tilted, as if listening to something beyond sound. The pull wasn't the fissure anymore. It was deeper, concentrated, coming from the sanctum itself, where Strange's ritual had begun to tear open a path downward. The only clean route to the source. The figure turned and walked back toward the ritual chamber. Strange descended the stairs to meet it. Still no words from behind that visor, just presence and purpose. Strange took a breath. You're here for the source. The figure said nothing, but it didn't leave. The anchor is deep, below the city, below the physical world. I can open a door, but... The figure walked past him toward the ritual chamber. Strange blinked. Then, despite everything, he smiled grimly. Right. No time for explanations. He followed the armored figure into the chamber where Wong was already reinforcing the gateway wards. The figure stopped at the edge of the circle, looking down at the half-formed portal. Strange raised his hands. This will take you into Hell's realm. There's no guarantee you'll survive. The source is defended by... The figure turned its head slightly, waiting. Strange exhaled. Fine. But you'll need this. He began tracing a new pattern in the air, golden light spiraling into a compact sigil. What you're hunting isn't just a physical object. It's a binding construct. An anchor written in infernal law, the infernal anchor. You can't destroy it with brute force alone. You need to touch the contract itself. He pressed the completed sigil against the figure's chest plate. The rune sank into the armor, glowing faintly before fading from view. There. Now your attacks can reach the anchor's framework. But every time you strike one, the sigil will burn. It's not infinite. The figure looked down at its chest, then back at the portal. One more thing. Strange's voice was quiet. Whatever you are, wherever you're from, thank you. For the sanctum. The figure's only response was to check its ammunition. Strange completed the gateway. The portal tore open, revealing a hellscape of burning stone and twisted geometry. Heat poured through, bringing with it the stench of sulfur and ash. The figure stepped through without hesitation. Strange watched it disappear into the inferno. Wong moved to his side. "What was that?" Wong asked. Strange shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but hell should be worried." The portal sealed shut, and the sanctum fell quiet. Outside, the fissure pulsed. The city burned. And somewhere far below, in a realm of eternal fire and binding contracts, the Doomslayer began his descent. Hell wasn't fire and brimstone. It was architecture. The Slayer landed on stone that breathed. The ground pulsed beneath his boots, veins of molten light running through obsidian like infected arteries. The air tasted of copper and ash. Gravity pulled wrong, not lighter, not heavier, just askew as if the realm itself operated on different physics. He rose, scanned, assessed. A corridor stretched ahead, walls carved with script that writhed when he looked directly at it. Not a language. A contract, terms and clauses bleeding into the stone itself. The anchor sigil on his chest flickered faintly, responding to the presence of infernal law. Movement. Shadows detached from the walls, lesser demon scouts attracted to the foreign signature. The Slayer's shotgun came up. Twin thunder spoke twice. The demons collapsed into ash before they could screech. He advanced. In the sanctum, Dr. Strange stood before the scrying mirror, watching. The portal had closed behind the armored figure, sealing hell off from Earth. But Strange had prepared. The mirror showed what his guest was seeing, a bird's-eye view filtered through the eye of Agamotto's perception. Wong stood at his side, maintaining the connection wards. "He's moving fast," Wong observed. "He knows where he's going." Strange's fingers traced idle patterns in the air, monitoring the anchor sigil's energy signature. The sigil is guiding him. Every binding point in that realm lights up like a beacon to someone carrying my mark. The mirror showed the Slayer entering a wider chamber. Stone pillars rose like ribs, and between them, smaller anchors pulsed substructures feeding power to something deeper below. The Slayer didn't hesitate. He planted charges at the base of the first pillar, moved to the second, then the third. Methodical, efficient. The charges detonated in sequence. The pillars crumbled. The sub-anchors guttered and died, and the entire chamber shuddered like a wounded beast. Strange allowed himself a grim nod. He's doing it. He's severing the outer bindings. A new voice cut through the room. "Doing what exactly?" Strange didn't turn. He'd felt Blade arrive 30 seconds ago, stepping through the sanctum's wards with the ease of someone who'd been granted access long ago. The vampire hunter stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the scrying mirror. "Cutting Manhattan loose from hell," Strange said simply. Blade stepped closer, studying the armored figure on the screen. "That's your solution? You summoned some kind of war machine?" "I didn't summon him. He came." Strange's tone was measured. "And I'm beginning to suspect he would have come whether I called or not." On the screen, the Slayer encountered his first real resistance. A pack of larger demons, hulking things with claws like scythes, surged out of the shadows. The Slayer's response was immediate. Ballista shot center mass. The lead demon's chest exploded. Dash forward meat hook to the second super shotgun, point blank. Glory kill, brutal, efficient. The remaining demons collapsed under sustained chain gun fire. Blade's expression didn't change, but his posture shifted. Less skeptical, more analytical. "It doesn't talk. Doesn't negotiate. Doesn't stop. No, Strange agreed quietly. It doesn't. Good. Blade's hand moved to the blade at his side. Because whatever hell threw at Manhattan is going to throw worse at that thing. And when it does, the backflow is going to hit the sanctum. Wong looked up sharply. You're certain demons don't like losing territory? They'll pull forces from the invasion to protect the anchor. Blade's gaze was steady, which means you're about to have company. Strange closed his hand, and additional wards materialized around the sanctum's perimeter layers of defensive magic, ceiling barriers, tripwires keyed to infernal signatures. Then we hold the line here. The gateway stays closed. He stays down there until the job is finished. Blade nodded once. I'll call in the sons. We'll keep your door locked. He turned and vanished into the shadows, moving with predatory grace. Wong glanced at Strange. The Midnight Sons. You trust them to hold. Blade hunts the supernatural for a living. Strange's attention returned to the mirror. If anyone understands what we're dealing with, it's him. On the screen, the Slayer descended deeper. The architecture grew more deliberate, more wrong. This wasn't random demon spawning, this was designed. A gauntlet meant to break anyone who tried to reach the core. The Slayer reloaded and kept moving. The gauntlet was a maze that refused to stay still. Corridors folded, walls shifted, floors opened into pits that screamed with voices. The Slayer navigated by sense, following the pull of the anchor sigil burned into his armor. Every sub-anchor he destroyed made the path clearer, the resonance stronger. He turned a corner and stopped. The chamber ahead was different, circular, lit by burning glyphs that hovered in the air like frozen flames. At the center stood something that wasn't quite a demon. It wore robes made of parchment, its body composed of shifting contracts and signatures. Eyes like ink stains, hands that ended in quills. The infernal auditor. It spoke not in words, but in clauses. Legal phrases that tried to bind themselves to the Slayer's mind, seeking purchase in thought and intent. Terms of service, conditions of entry, penalties for trespass. The Slayer raised his crucible. The auditor gestured, and chains materialized, not metal, but crystallized agreements, binding terms made manifest. They wrapped around the Slayer's limbs, tried to lock him in place. The anchor's sigil flared, burning against the contracts. The chains held. For 3 seconds. The Slayer broke forward. The sigils scorched through the bindings, unwriting them, clause by clause. The auditor recoiled, summoning more contracts, layering them like armor. The Slayer didn't slow. Ballista shot piercing through parchment skin, dashed closing distance. The crucible came down. The blade didn't just cut, it annulled. Where the energy weapon touched the auditor's form, contracts burned away like paper in a furnace. The creature shrieked a sound like tearing legal documents and tried to retreat. The Slayer caught it mid-step, crucible plunging through the center mass. The auditor's form collapsed inward, unraveling into ash and scattered signatures. The chamber fell silent. The Slayer straightened, crucible still glowing. He looked down at his chest. The anchor's sigil had dimmed slightly, the first traces of burn marks appearing around its edges. Each use consumed it little by little. Limited resource. Had to be precise. He sheathed the crucible and continued deeper. Back in the sanctum, Blade returned with reinforcements. The Midnight Sons weren't an army. They were specialists, hunters and mystics, who dealt with threats the Avengers couldn't touch. Blade led them through the sanctum's main hall, each one taking up position at key defensive points. Strange acknowledged them with a nod. The external wards are holding, but I'm reading pressure building along the perimeter. They're going to test us soon. Let them. Blade checked his weapon's silver stakes, UV grenades, the katana strapped to his back. We've handled worse. One of the sons, a woman with tattoos that glowed faintly in the dark, stepped forward. What's the play if the gateway destabilizes? It won't, Strange said firmly. I built it to withstand feedback from below. As long as he keeps moving forward, the structure holds. And if he doesn't? Strange didn't answer immediately. On the scrying mirror, the Slayer was carving through another wave of demons. Each kill precise and brutal. The sigil pulsed with every strike against the sub-anchors, burning brighter and dimmer in rhythm with his progress. He will, Strange said finally. That's what he does. The first attack came 10 minutes later. Demons hit the sanctum's outer wards like a battering ram, claws raking against invisible barriers. The wards held, but the strain was immediate. Strange felt the pressure through the mystical lattice. Hundreds of lesser demons coordinated, focused on one goal. Break the gateway, cut off the intruder below. Positions! Blade's voice cut through the chaos. The midnight suns moved. Holy water barriers activated along the windows. Runic tripwires flared to life across the courtyard. Blade himself took point at the main entrance, katana-drawn eyes locked on the door. Wong raised both hands, reinforcing the inner seals. They're pulling forces from the fissure. The invasion is slowing. Good. Strange's cloak billowed as he ascended to the upper balcony, hands moving through complex patterns. That means he's hurting them. The demons broke through the first ward. Blade met them at the threshold. Silver blade flashed, heads rolled. The first wave collapsed, but the second was already climbing over the corpses. UV grenades detonated, turning the courtyard into a killing field of light and ash. Strange conjured mandalas, geometric shields that deflected claws and teeth. Hold the perimeter. Don't let them reach the ritual chamber. The battle settled into rhythm. Push and counterpush, the midnight suns holding the line, while Strange maintained the connection below. Every minute that passed was another sub-anchor, destroyed another piece of Hell's claim on Manhattan severed. On the scrying mirror, the Slayer reached a junction point. The architecture opened into a vast vertical shaft. Sub-anchors lining the walls like rungs on a ladder, descending into darkness. At the bottom, barely visible through the haze of infernal energy, something massive pulsed. The core. The infernal anchor itself. The Slayer looked down. Then he stepped off the edge and dropped. Strange watched him fall, plummeting through the shaft, firing at sub-anchors as he passed them. Each shot was calculated, each impact deliberate. The sigil burned brighter with every strike, consuming itself to break the bindings. He's going for the heart, Strange murmured. Above, the sanctum shook as another wave hit the wards. Below, the Slayer landed in a crouch at the bottom of the shaft, surrounded by the burning remains of shattered sub-anchors. Ahead of him, a corridor stretched toward a chamber that radiated wrong light. The pull was undeniable now. The infernal anchor was close. And between him and it, Hell was gathering everything it had left. The Slayer checked his ammunition. Reloaded. The anchor sigil on his chest was half consumed, now edges blackened and cracked. Enough to finish this. He advanced into the corridor, and the walls began to bleed. The border zone between Earth and Hell was a wound that wouldn't close. Strange felt it through the wards, a thinning in the dimensional membrane, where the Slayer's rampage had torn too many bindings too quickly. The sub-anchors were falling, yes, but their collapse was destabilizing the barrier itself. Energy bled through in both directions, creating a liminal space where neither realm held full dominion. And something else had noticed. The scrying mirror flickered. Strange leaned forward, watching the Slayer advance through a corridor that looked less like hell and more like a negative photograph of reality. The walls were translucent, showing glimpses of Earth's streets overlaid with infernal architecture. A dangerous convergence. Then the mirror went dark. Wong, Strange's hands moved immediately, trying to restore the connection. Nothing. The wards were intact, the gateway stable, but something was blocking his view. Wong's face was grim. Something entered the border zone, something with enough presence to interfere with the eye's sight. Strange's jaw tightened. Then we're blind. Below, in the space between worlds, the Slayer was no longer alone. The corridor opened into a cavern where physics fought itself. Gravity pulled in 3 directions at once. The ground was solid stone, but also pavement, but also something that pulsed like living tissue. The air smelled of sulfur and rain. Shadows moved wrong, cast by light sources that didn't exist. The Slayer stopped. A sound cut through the distortion, the roar of an engine that burned hotter than any combustion. A motorcycle tore through the dimensional membrane, like paper wheels leaving trails of hellfire across the warped ground. It skidded to a halt 30 feet away. The rider dismounted. Flame, skull, leather jacket scorched black. The Ghost Rider stood in the liminal space chain, already unwinding from his skeletal grip. Fire poured from his empty sockets, illuminating the cavern in harsh orange light. You. The voice was gravel and burning wood. You don't belong here. You don't belong anywhere. The Slayer said nothing. His hand moved to the super shotgun on his back, but didn't draw. Assessment mode. Not a demon. Not human either. Category uncertain. Ghost Rider took a step forward, chain scraping across stone and pavement simultaneously. Hell is screaming because of you. The damned are afraid. That's not supposed to happen. Another step, so I'm going to look into you. See what you've done. See what you are. The Slayer's helmet tilted slightly. Still no words. Look at me. The command carried weight, not magical compulsion, but something older. Divine judgment made manifest. The spirit of vengeance demanding audience with sin itself. The Slayer looked. Hellfire met visor. The penance stare activated a torrent of judgment designed to burn guilt into the soul, to make the wicked feel every crime they'd ever committed. The Ghost Rider had broken demons, warlords, and monsters with this power. He'd reduced the irredeemable to catatonic husks. The Slayer stood. 3 seconds. 5, 10. The hellfire intensified, pouring from the rider's skull in waves. The cavern heated like a furnace. Stone began to crack. The Slayer's armor steamed, but he didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't fall. The Ghost Rider's skeletal jaw tightened. He pushed harder, channeling more of the spirit's power. The penance stare wasn't failing. It was finding nothing to burn. No guilt, no regret, no crimes against the innocent. Only war, only purpose, only the endless grinding destruction of those who'd earned it. The connection broke. Ghost Rider staggered back, flame guttering for a moment before roaring back to life. He stared at the Slayer, recognition settling over him like ash. You're not a monster. You're a consequence. The Slayer lowered his gaze, turned toward the corridor leading deeper into hell. Wait. The rider's voice had changed. Less accusation, more respect. You're going after the heart of this invasion. Not a question. The Slayer didn't respond. He just stood there, waiting to see if the rider would become an obstacle. Ghost Rider looked past him into the depths, where the infernal anchor pulsed. Then we go together. Hell's pulling everything it has to defend the core. You'll need someone to clear the path. The Slayer studied him for a long moment, then gave a single curt nod. The alliance wasn't friendship. It was two weapons pointing the same direction. The Hell convoy materialized in the next chamber. Dozens of demons in formation, organized like a military unit. At their center, a transport construct, a massive cage of bone and iron filled with captured souls, meant to fuel the infernal anchor's final defenses. The convoy was moving fast, hauling its cargo toward the core. Ghost Rider's chain whipped out, wrapping around the lead demon's throat. He yanked, pulling the creature off its feet, then swung the chain in a wide arc. Hellfire erupted along its length, turning the corridor into a blazing barrier. Left flank is yours. The Slayer was already moving. Dash, meat hook to the nearest demon, super shotgun point blank. The demon's head vaporized. Ballista shot through the second. Chain gun spun up, turning the right flank into a kill corridor. Shells clanged against stone. Ichor sprayed. Ghost Rider rode through the center motorcycle, tearing through demon ranks like a blade. His chain swept out in wide arcs, each link burning with divine retribution. Where it touched, demons didn't just die, they unraveled existence itself, rejecting their presence in the face of vengeance made real. The transport cage buckled under the assault. The Slayer vaulted onto its roof, planted charges, dropped back to the ground. The explosion tore through the construct's bindings, and the captured souls poured out, not freed, but no longer fodder for the anchor. They dissipated into the liminal space, seeking whatever rest Hell would allow. The convoy collapsed. Ghost Rider skidded to a halt beside the Slayer chain coiling back around his arm. Ahead, the corridor opened into a wider passage walls, carved with symbols that writhed faster now, more desperate. Hell knew they were close. The anchor nodes are failing, Ghost Rider said. His voice carried a grim satisfaction. Whatever you did to the sub-anchors, it's working. The whole structure is destabilizing. The Slayer checked his ammunition, reloaded. The anchor's sigil on his chest had burned darker edges, charred almost to nothing. Maybe a dozen strikes left. Had to count. Ghost Rider noticed the sigil's condition. That's not going to last much longer. The Slayer didn't need the observation. He started walking toward the passage. The rider watched him go, then gunned his engine. "You really don't talk, do you?" No response. Just steady, relentless forward momentum. Ghost Rider allowed himself something that might have been a grin if skulls could grin. "Fine. I'll make enough noise for both of us." They advanced together, flame and fury, into the deepening dark. The passage ended at a rift. Not a doorway, not a portal. A tear in the fabric of hell itself, edges glowing with sick light that pulsed in time with something massive beyond. Through the rift, the Slayer could see at the chamber where the infernal anchor sat, a geometric nightmare of chains and contracts and bound souls, stretching toward earth like roots seeking water. But the rift was closing. Demon reinforcements poured through from deeper chambers, scrambling to seal the gap before the intruders could reach the heart. They moved with coordinated desperation, throwing themselves at the two figures like a living barricade. Ghost Rider's chain blazed. "We punch through, now!" The Slayer's crucible ignited. They hit the demon wall as one unit. Ghost Rider's chain carved wide scything through limbs and torsos. The Slayer cut precise each strike with the crucible, annulling the space where a demon stood. No waste, no excess, just elimination. The rift narrowed. 10 feet? 8. Plasma fire from the Slayer's rifle scorched through clustered demons. Ghost Rider's hellfire detonated in waves, clearing swaths. They fought not for glory, not for survival, but for progress. Every inch forward was an inch closer to ending this. 6 feet. 4. The Slayer glimpsed movement in his peripheral, a massive shape rising behind Ghost Rider claws, aimed at the rider's unprotected back. No time to shout. No need. Ballista shot. The demon's chest exploded before the blow could land. Ghost Rider glanced back, then forward again. Appreciated. 2 feet. They dove through. The rift collapsed behind them with a sound like tearing metal. They hit the ground on the other side and rolled, coming up in combat stances. But the chamber beyond was empty of enemies. They'd reached the threshold. Ahead through an archway carved from petrified screams, the glow of the infernal anchor pulsed like a diseased star. The air was thick with binding energy contracts, made manifest the weight of Hell's claim on Manhattan, pressing down like atmosphere. Ghost Rider rose to his feet, flame burning low but steady. This is where I stop. The Slayer turned to face him. The anchor chamber is pure law, the rider explained. Contracts, clauses. I'm bound to different rules. I can't cross that threshold without becoming subject to Hell's jurisdiction. He gestured toward the archway. But you're not part of any covenant. You're a variable they never wrote into the terms. The Slayer looked at the archway, then back at the rider. Ghost Rider's skull tilted in something like acknowledgement. Go, finish it. The Slayer gave a single nod. Then he turned and walked through the archway into the heart of Hell's claim on Earth. Ghost Rider watched him disappear into the pulsing light. Then he turned back to face the sealed rift chain at the ready. When Hell realized what was about to happen, reinforcements would come, and when they did, they'd have to go through him first. He settled into a stance, hellfire brightening. Come on then, he murmured to the dark. Let's see what you've got. Behind him, deeper in the chamber, the Slayer's war entered its final phase. And somewhere above the sky over Hell began to crack. The sky over Hell cracked like an eggshell. Not from below, from above. Dr. Strange felt it through the wards, a pressure that had nothing to do with demons or infernal contracts. This was different. Colder. Older. He spun toward the scrying mirror, which had flickered back to life the moment the Slayer crossed into the anchor chamber. But the image it showed now wasn't the chamber. It was the sky. Hell's firmament, such as it was, had always been a roiling mass of red-black clouds and perpetual storm. Now, it was tearing. Rips spread across the heavens like cracks in glass, and through them poured something that made Hell itself recoil. Darkness. Not absence of light, but darkness as a substance. As an invasion. No. Strange's voice was barely a whisper. Not now. Not here. Wong moved to his side, staring at the mirror. What is that? The dark dimension. Strange's hands clenched. Dormammu. In the border zone, Ghost Rider felt the temperature drop. Hellfire shouldn't feel cold. It burned at temperatures that could crack stone and boil metal. But now the flame around his skull guttered, wavering, as if something was drinking the heat from the air itself. He looked up. The cracks in Hell's sky widened. Through them, geometric patterns emerged, impossible angles, spaces that folded in on themselves. Shadow-given form and malicious intent. The dark dimension wasn't entering Hell through a door. It was bleeding in like ink, seeping through paper. "That's not good," Ghost Rider muttered. Behind him, through the archway, the Slayer's presence was a steady pulse of focused destruction. Still advancing, still hunting the anchor, unaware that the war had just gained a third faction. The first dark tether materialized 15 feet away, a strand of living shadow that reached down from the cracks like a grasping tentacle. Where it touched Hell's stone, the material warped, geometry inverted, space folded. Then another tether appeared, and another. They weren't attacking. They were claiming. Ghost Rider's chain blazed brighter, pushing back the encroaching cold. Of course, why fight one Hell when you can fight two? Dante. Deep in the anchor chamber, the Slayer stepped into an arena of pure infernal law. The chamber was vast cathedral-like, but twisted. Pillars of bound contracts rose like columns, each one inscribed with thousands of signatures in languages that hurt to perceive. At the center, suspended in chains of crystallized agreement, the infernal anchor pulsed. It wasn't an object. It was a concept made physical. A hook driven into reality itself, pulling Manhattan into Hell's jurisdiction, one clause at a time. The Slayer raised his crucible. "Stop!" The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. Smooth, cultured, poisonous. Mephisto materialized from the shadows between the pillars. He wore his human aspect tailored suit. Devil's smile, fingers steepled as if in prayer. But the air around him rippled with power, and the contracts on the pillars bent toward him like flowers seeking sun. "This is my realm," Mephisto said, pacing slowly around the chamber's perimeter. "My domain, my law." He gestured at the anchor. "That is a legally binding construct. You cannot simply destroy it with violence." The Slayer's grip on the crucible didn't waver. Mephisto smiled. Strong, silent, admirably direct. "But you're in a courtroom now, warrior. And in a courtroom, the one who writes the rules wins." He snapped his fingers. The chamber transformed. What had been a cathedral became something else, a blend of throne room and judicial hall. The pillars shifted, reorganizing into witness stands and jury boxes. The floor became polished obsidian, etched with legal precedent. The anchor remained at the center, but now it was surrounded by a ring of binding circles, each one labeled with charges. Trespassing, destruction of property, breach of contract, contempt of Hell. "Emergency clause," Mephisto announced, his voice echoing with the weight of ancient law. "Martial law of the realm. All intruders are hereby subject to judgment." The circles flared. Chains of pure legality shot toward the Slayer, wrapping around his limbs. Not physical restraints, these were jurisdictional. Claims. Arguments that he had violated terms simply by existing here. The anchor's sigil on the Slayer's chest burned. The chains slowed, weakened. But they didn't break. Mephisto's smile widened. "You see, Dr. Strange's little mark helps you touch my contracts. But it doesn't make you immune to them." He began to circle closer. "Now, let us discuss terms. Surrender. Leave. And I will allow Manhattan to..." The chamber shook. Not from the Slayer, from above. Mephisto froze his expression, shifting from smug satisfaction to sudden sharp alarm. "What?" The ceiling cracked. Dark dimension energy poured through shadow geometry, bleeding into the chamber like oil spreading across water. The contracts on the walls flickered their text, scrambling as reality itself became uncertain. Mephisto's facade dropped. His human aspect peeled away, revealing the demon lord beneath Horn's crimson skin, power radiating like heat from a furnace. "No, not here. Not in my seat of power." But Dormammu wasn't asking permission. The dark dimension's intrusion was surgical. Dormammu wasn't invading hell to conquer it. He was exploiting the weakness the Slayer had created. The sub-anchors destroyed, the binding severed. The infernal anchor was failing, and in its failure, it had opened pathways. Shortcuts. Access to Earth without needing to fight through Hell's defenses. The dark tethers multiplied, reaching down through the cracks in Hell's infrastructure. Each one was a lifeline, a connection point that could be strengthened, widened, turned into a permanent bridge between the dark dimension and Manhattan. Dr. Strange saw it all through the scrying mirror and felt his blood turn cold. "He's bypassing Hell," Strange said, hands already moving through defensive patterns. "Using the anchor's collapse as a foothold. If those tethers reach Earth, they'll pull the city into the dark dimension," Wong finished. "Mephisto loses Manhattan. Dormammu gains it." Strange's jaw set. "We need to cut the tethers, now." But even as he spoke, he knew the truth. They couldn't reach the tethers from Earth. The connection points were too deep, too far into the dimensional breach. The only one who could sever them was the Slayer. Strange whispered. On the mirror, the armored figure stood in the transformed chamber, caught between Mephisto's legal bindings and the encroaching darkness of Dormammu's geometry. The Devil Lord was screaming orders, reinforcing his wards, trying to seal the breach. But his attention was divided, and the Slayer was still moving. The courtroom maze wasn't just binding, it was reshaping the battlefield. Corridors of legal precedent materialized between the pillars. Walls of jurisprudence rose and fell. Every step the Slayer took triggered new charges, new claims. Trespassing became breaking and entering. Destruction became vandalism. The law piled on itself, trying to bury him in technicalities. But the Slayer had never cared about technicalities. He raised the crucible and brought it down on the nearest binding circle. The anchor sigil flared, burning through another layer of its limited reserves. The circle cracked. The charges dissolved. Mephisto's contempt of Hell's status flickered. "Fool!" Mephisto snarled, redirecting his focus from the dark dimension breach. "Every strike burns your mark. You'll run out of power before you reach the anchor." The Slayer didn't respond. He just kept advancing, cutting through legal barriers with the same mechanical precision he'd used on demons. Each slash of the crucible annulled another clause. Each step forward was earned through pure grinding determination. And above Dormammu's invasion intensified. Shadow geometry warped the chamber's architecture. Pillars bent at impossible angles. Floors became walls. Walls became ceilings. The dark tethers snaked through the chaos, seeking anchor points, trying to establish permanent connections. The Slayer pivoted mid-stride. He saw the tethers for what they were, another binding, another claim just written in a different language. His plasma rifle came up. Sustained fire scorched through the nearest tether. It recoiled, hissing like a living thing. Mephisto saw the opening. While the Slayer was distracted, the Devil Lord summoned a fresh wave of courtroom constructs, spectral judges' jury boxes that launched binding verdicts, bailiffs made of solidified law. They converged on the Slayer from 3 directions. The Slayer didn't choose sides. He killed them all. Chain gun fire shredded the bailiffs. A ballista shot impaled 2 jury constructs. Meat hook to a judge. Super shotgun execution. The crucible carved through a dark tether that had gotten too close, and the weapon's energy resonated with something in the shadow, recognition, perhaps, that this wasn't just violence. This was annihilation of concepts. The chamber descended into chaos. Mephisto fought to maintain his martial law construct. Dormammu pressed the Dark Dimension invasion. And the Slayer moved through the center of it all like a scythe through wheat, killing everything that stood between him and the anchor. In the sanctum, Strange made a decision. "I'm going in." Wong grabbed his arm. "Stephen, if you enter that space, you'll be subject to the same bindings." "I know." Strange's voice was firm. "But I can reinforce the sigil. Give him more time, enough to reach the anchor and end this. And if Dormammu targets you..." Strange's cloak billowed. "Then I'll do what I always do. Improvise." He raised both hands, tearing open a new gateway, not to the chamber, but to the border zone where Ghost Rider held the line. If he could coordinate with the Rider, create a buffer between the Slayer and Dormammu's tethers, the gateway opened. And something unexpected happened. And Ghost Rider had been fighting the Dark Dimension's advance for what felt like hours. His hellfire pushed back the shadows, but they kept coming. Relentless. Patient. Dormammu didn't need to win quickly. He just needed to outlast. Then the golden portal tore open beside him, and Dr. Strange stepped through. "Rider," Strange said, hands already weaving barrier spells. "I need you to burn those tethers. All of them. Sever Dormammu's connection points." Ghost Rider's skull turned toward him. "And what will you be doing?" "Making sure our friend down there has enough power to finish his job." Strange gestured toward the archway leading to the anchor chamber. "Can you hold this position?" The Rider's chain ignited with fresh hellfire. "Can I hold, Doctor? I'm the spirit of vengeance. This is what I do." Strange allowed himself a tight smile. "Good. Because this is going to get worse before it gets better." He moved toward the archway, cloak trailing. Behind him, Ghost Rider launched himself at the nearest cluster of dark tethers, chain whirling. Hellfire met shadow geometry, and the border zone erupted into a war of fundamental forces. Strange reached the threshold of the anchor chamber and stopped. Inside, the Slayer was surrounded. Mephisto's constructs on one side, Dormammu's shadows on the other. The anchor's sigil on the Slayer's chest was nearly spent, barely glowing edges charred to ash. Strange extended one hand. The eye of Agamotto flared. Golden light shot across the chamber, striking the Slayer's armor. The sigil blazed back to life, not fully restored, but reinforced. Enough for another dozen strikes, maybe more. The Slayer glanced back just for a moment. Recognition, not gratitude. Just acknowledgement of a tool provided. He turned back to the anchor and advanced. Mephisto saw what Strange had done and roared. "Interference, breach of protocol. You cannot..." "I just did," Strange said calmly. He raised both hands, and the sanctum's full power channeled through him. Golden mandalas materialized, forming a protective corridor between the Slayer and the converging threats. "Now, finish it." The Slayer didn't need to be told twice. He charged, crucible blazing, sigil burning, purpose absolute. Mephisto threw everything he had, walls of binding law, chains of precedent, the full weight of hell's jurisdiction. Dormammu's shadows pressed in from above, trying to claim the anchor for the dark dimension. And the Slayer cut through it all. Each strike of the crucible annulled another layer. Each step forward cost him another fragment of the sigil's power. But he didn't stop. Didn't slow. The anchor was 10 feet away. 8. 6. Mephisto's voice rose to a shriek. You're destroying the balance. If the anchor falls, the feedback will 4 feet. Dormammu's tethers lashed out, trying to wrap around the Slayer's limbs. Strange's barriers deflected them, golden light against living shadow. 2 feet. The Slayer raised the crucible one final time. The anchor pulsed, sensing its end. And somewhere far above in Manhattan, the fissure began to collapse. The blade came down, not yet impact, not yet resolution, just the beginning of the end. And in that frozen moment, hell itself held its breath. The crucible struck the first anchor strut. The impact rang like a bell tolling the end of worlds. The strut, a pillar of crystallized contracts 20 feet tall, cracked down its length. Light bled from the fracture, not fire or energy, but pure conceptual dissolution. The bindings holding Manhattan to hell began to unravel clause by clause, signature by signature. The anchor sigil on the Slayer's chest ignited in agony. It didn't just dim, it burned searing into the Praetor suit's plating like a brand. The runes that Strange had painstakingly inscribed turned black edges, crumbling to ash. One strike, one strut down. 3 more to go, and the sigil was already dying. Mephisto felt the first strut fall and screamed, not in pain, in fury, in recognition of what was about to happen. You don't understand what you're doing. The anchor isn't just a claim, it's a load-bearing pillar. If you destroy it completely, the dimensional pressure will equalize violently. The backlash will tear. The Slayer moved to the second strut. Dormammu's shadows surged forward, dark tethers lashing out to intercept. They wrapped around the Slayer's arms, trying to pull him away from the anchor, trying to redirect his momentum toward the rifts in Hell's ceiling, where the dark dimension waited to consume him. The Slayer didn't fight the pull. He used it. Meathook fired, grappling to the second strut. The tethers yanked him sideways, but the hook was faster. He flew across the chamber, boots slamming into the strut's base, and brought the crucible down in a 2-handed overhead strike. The second strut shattered. The anchor sigil flared white-hot. The Slayer felt it through the armor, not pain, not exactly, but cost. The price of touching infernal law with mortal weapons. The sigil was a bridge, and every step across it burned the planks beneath his feet. 2 down, 2 to go. The chamber buckled. Reality itself was starting to come apart. The courtroom maze, collapsed walls dissolving back into raw hellstone. Mephisto's constructs flickered and died, unable to maintain coherence as the anchor's power bled away. The Devil Lord himself staggered his form, wavering between aspects human-demon, something older and more terrible beneath. "Fool!" Mephisto hissed, but his voice had lost its certainty. "Even if you sever my claim, you're just handing Manhattan to him." He gestured upward, where Dormammu's presence pressed down like a collapsing ceiling. "Is that what you want? To trade one damnation for another?" The Slayer's response was to reload. He advanced on the third strut. In the border zone, Ghost Rider was losing ground. The dark tethers had multiplied. For every one he burned, 2 more descended from the cracks in Hell's sky. They were learning, adapting, coiling around his chain to smother the hellfire before striking at him directly. "Strange," Ryder's voice cut through the chaos. Whatever he's doing down there, it's making this worse. Strange stood at the threshold, maintaining the barrier that kept Dormammu's shadows from overwhelming the Slayer. His hands moved in constant motion, weaving layer after layer of protective magic. Sweat beaded on his forehead. The strain was immense. "He's destroying the anchor," Strange said through gritted teeth. "2 struts down. When the 4th falls, the binding will collapse completely." "And then what?" Ghost Rider whipped his chain through a cluster of tethers, hellfire scorching them to vapor. "The dark dimension just walks in." "No." Strange's voice was tight with effort. "Then we close the door." "How?" Strange didn't answer. He was calculating. The moment the anchor fell, there would be a brief window, a fraction of a second, where both Hell's claim and Dormammu's invasion would be in flux. If Strange could time it perfectly, he could seal the breach. Lock out both threats. But it would require shutting the gateway, trapping the Slayer on the other side. Strange's jaw clenched. One problem at a time. "Just hold the line, Rider. I'll handle the rest." Ghost Rider grunted and threw himself back into the fight chain, blazing. Dante, the 3rd strut fell. The Slayer's strike was perfect angled to shear through the weakest point in the crystallized contracts. The strut exploded into fragments, and the anchor's pulse stuttered like a heart in arrest. The sigil on the Slayer's chest was almost gone. Barely a flicker remained, edges burned so thoroughly that the original runes were unrecognizable. 1 strike left. Maybe 2 if he was precise. Enough. The 4th strut stood before him, pulsing with desperate energy. The anchor itself seemed to realize what was happening. The chamber's atmosphere thickened, pressure building like water behind a dam. If the Slayer struck this final pillar, the dam would break. Mephisto materialized directly in his path. Gone was the cultured devil in the tailored suit. What stood before the Slayer now was Mephisto unbound, towering wreathed in crimson flame horns, curling like a throne's armrests. His presence filled the chamber, power radiating in waves. "Enough," Mephisto said, and his voice carried the weight of eons. "You want to end this? Fine. Let us end it properly." He extended one clawed hand. "I offer you a deal." The Slayer didn't stop walking. "Listen to me." Mephisto's voice cracked like thunder. "I can give you what you want. The war you're fighting, the endless crusade against hell, I can end it. Give you peace, rest, an end to the suffering you've endured." The Slayer's grip on the crucible tightened. "I know what you've lost." Mephisto pressed, desperation creeping into his tone. "I know why you fight. Let me give it back to you. Everything, everyone. A reality where none of it happened. Where you never had to become this." The Slayer took another step forward. Mephisto's facade cracked. "Why won't you negotiate? Why won't you?" The Slayer raised the crucible and pointed it at the 4th strut. Message clear. Move or become collateral. Mephisto's expression twisted. "Then burn with your principles." He struck. Not with fire or claws, but with law itself. The full weight of hell's jurisdiction came down on the Slayer. Every crime, every trespass, every violation compressed into a single binding judgment. The courtroom maze reasserted itself in a last desperate surge, chains of precedent wrapping around the Slayer's limbs, his torso, his helmet. The Slayer dropped to one knee. The chains tightened. Mephisto loomed over him, power building for a final execution. You could have had peace. Instead, you chose. The Slayer's free hand moved. Plasma rifle. point blank into Mephisto's chest. The Devil Lord staggered back more from shock than damage. The chains loosened for a fraction of a second. Enough. The Slayer surged upward, tearing through the bindings with pure physical force. The sigil flared one last time, scorching through the legal restraints. He closed the distance to the fourth strut in 3 strides. Mephisto reached out too slow. Dormammu's shadows descended too late. The crucible came down. The fourth strut didn't just break, it annihilated. The crystallized contracts dissolved into light and ash. The anchor's pulse stopped. And in that moment of absolute stillness, the chamber hung suspended between states, no longer hell not yet free, caught in the instant before collapse. Then reality caught up. The backlash hit like a tidal wave. Energy exploded outward from the anchor's corpse, a shockwave of unbound contracts and severed claims. The chamber's walls blew apart. The pillars dissolved. Mephisto was hurled backward, his form flickering, destabilizing as his seat of power crumbled beneath him. Dormammu's invasion faltered. The dark tethers, suddenly without an anchor point to connect to, flailed wildly. The cracks in Hell's sky sealed not from strength, but from the sheer violence of the dimensional backlash. The dark dimension recoiled, ejected from the breach it had tried to exploit. In the border zone, Ghost Rider felt the change instantly. The tethers withered and died. The shadows retreated. He stood in the sudden silence, chains still burning, and allowed himself a grim smile. He did it. Strange felt it too. The binding between Manhattan and Hell, the contract that had been etching itself into the city's foundation, was gone. Severed. The fissure above ground would collapse. The invasion would end. But the Slayer was still down there. Strange turned toward the anchor chamber, hands already moving to open an extraction portal. He had seconds, maybe less, before the entire structure came down. The chamber imploded, not slowly, not gracefully. The space where the anchor had been simply ceased to exist, folding in on itself like a singularity. Hell's architecture collapsed inward, stone and contract and burning air compressing into a point of absolute nothing. Strange's portal snapped shut before it could fully form. The feedback knocked him backward. Wong caught him, steadied him. "Stephen." "I know." Strange's voice was hollow. He stared at the space where the chamber had been, where the Slayer had been. Gone. Sar, the Slayer fell through collapsing dimensions. The chamber was gone. Hell was gone. He tumbled through a void that had no up or down, no light or dark. Just absence. The crucible was still in his hand, inert now, its purpose fulfilled. The anchor's sigil on his chest had burned away completely, leaving only a blackened scar on the armor's plating. He didn't fight the fall. There was nothing to fight. Just the endless tumble through spaces between spaces. Then he hit something solid. Not ground, not stone. Something else. He landed hard-rolled, came up in a crouch. Silence. The Slayer stood slowly, scanning his surroundings. He was somewhere. Not hell, not earth. A gray expanse that stretched in all directions, featureless and empty. A place between places. A scar in reality where something enormous had been torn out. In the distance, barely visible through the gray haze, he could see a faint light. Not fire. Not infernal glow. Something colder, sharper. A way out. The Slayer checked his weapons. Ammunition low but not empty. Armor damaged but functional. The sigil was gone, but he didn't need it anymore. The anchor was destroyed. The contract was severed. Mission complete. He started walking toward the light. No rush, no urgency, just steady, relentless forward movement. The same momentum that had carried him through hell, through the gauntlet, through the two-hell war. He would find a way out. He always did. Behind him in the gray void, something stirred. A ripple in the emptiness. Not a threat. Not yet. But a reminder that even in the spaces between worlds, nothing stayed empty for long. The Slayer didn't look back. He just kept walking. One step, then another, then another. The light grew brighter. In the sanctum, Dr. Strange stood before the sealed gateway, hands clenched at his sides. Wong spoke quietly. "Stephen, the dimensional readings are stabilizing. Manhattan is safe, I know." Strange's voice was flat. He gestured at the scrying mirror, which now showed only static. "But he's not. You did everything you could. Did I?" Strange turned away from the gateway cloak, billowing. "I used him. Gave him the tools he needed and sent him into hell to solve our problem. And when the job was done, I couldn't even bring him back." Wong was silent for a long moment. Then, "He knew the risks. He went anyway. That doesn't make it right." "No," Wong agreed quietly, "but it was necessary." Strange closed his hands, and the scrying mirror went dark. Outside, the sounds of the city were returning to normal. Sirens, traffic, life continuing unaware of how close it had come to damnation. The fissure would close, the demons would retreat, Manhattan would be saved. But the cost gnawed at him. "Keep monitoring the dimensional barriers," Strange said finally. "If there's any sign, any indication that he made it out, I want to know immediately." Wong nodded and moved to the monitoring station. Strange stood alone in the ritual chamber, staring at the spot where the gateway had been. Somewhere out there, in the spaces between worlds, a warrior walked alone through the gray. And Dr. Strange could only hope that the path would lead him home, or at least somewhere he could continue his war. Because men like that didn't stop. They didn't rest. They just found the next fight, the next threat, the next hell. Strange turned away and climbed the stairs to the sanctum's upper levels, where dawn was beginning to break over a city that had survived the night. But the victory felt hollow, and the debt remained unpaid. Manhattan woke to silence. The fissure was gone. Where 42nd and 7th had been torn open, there was now only cracked pavement and scattered debris. The building still stood damaged, but intact. The morning light filtered through the haze of settling dust, painting everything in shades of gray and gold. Captain America walked the perimeter shield resting against his back. The evacuation zones were being dismantled. First responders moved through the streets, checking for survivors, cataloging damage. CHIELD had established a command post 3 blocks out, coordinating the recovery effort. But something felt wrong. Steve stopped at the edge of where the fissure had been. The ground was scarred, not just physically, but in a way that made his skin crawl. The air tasted off. Reality felt thin here, like paper stretched too tight over a frame. Tony landed beside him, repulsors powering down. "Jarvis is picking up residual energy signatures. Nothing dangerous, but definitely not normal." "Nothing about this was normal," Steve said quietly. Tony's faceplate retracted. He looked tired. "Strange is calling it a dimensional scar. Says the binding between hell and Manhattan was severed so violently that it left marks. Weak points where the membrane between worlds is thinner than it should be." Steve frowned. "Will they heal?" "Eventually. Maybe." Strange isn't sure. Tony's jaw tightened. He also says the armored guy didn't make it out. Steve was quiet for a long moment. Then, he saved the city. Yeah, Tony's voice was flat. He did. They stood in silence, two men who'd seen too much, lost too much, survived too much. The city around them was alive, sirens' voices, the steady rhythm of recovery. But here at Ground Zero, there was only the scar and the memory of a warrior who'd walked into hell and never come back. Steve turned away. Let's finish the sweep. There are still people who need help. Tony nodded and lifted off repulsors flaring. Behind them, the scar pulsed once, faint, almost imperceptible, but not quite gone. In the sanctum, Dr. Strange stood before a wall of arcane instruments, monitoring the dimensional barriers across Manhattan. Wong worked beside him, cataloging the after-effects of the severed binding. 17 scar zones identified, Wong reported. Most are stable. 3 are showing minor fluctuations, but nothing that poses an immediate threat. Strange nodded absently. His attention was divided, half on the readouts, half on the empty space where the gateway had been. 3 days had passed since the anchor fell. 3 days with no sign of the Slayer. Stephen, Wong's voice was gentle. You need to accept. I know what I need to accept. Strange's tone was sharper than he intended. He exhaled, forced himself to relax. I'm sorry, You want to bring him back? He deserves better than being trapped in some dimensional void. Strange gestured at the instruments. If I can just find the right frequency, locate where he fell. And if you open another door, risk another invasion. Strange's hands stilled. Wong was right, of course. Opening portals into unstable dimensional spaces was dangerous, reckless. But the debt gnawed at him. I used him, Strange said quietly. Gave him a tool and pointed him at the problem. And when it was over, I couldn't even... He stopped. One of the monitors had spiked. Wong moved to his side. What is it? Strange's fingers danced across the mystical interface, pulling up readings from across the city. A fluctuation. One of the scar zones just activated. Which one? Strange's expression darkened. The smallest one, in an alley off 39th Street. He paused, studying the data. It's pulling something through. Wong's hand moved to a defensive artifact. Should we? No. Strange's voice was firm. Not yet. Let's see what comes through. He conjured a scrying window, focusing on the alley. The image resolved, showing a narrow space between 2 buildings. And there, on the cracked asphalt, a shimmer in the air. A tiny tear barely visible, no larger than a fist. Something moved on the other side. The alley was empty when the Slayer stepped through. The tear sealed behind him, immediately reality stitching itself closed. He stood for a moment, armor still scarred and blackened the mark where the anchor sigil had burned visible even in the dim light. Steam rose from his shoulders. His weapons hung silent at his sides. He'd found the path, followed the light through the gray void to a weak point, a place where hell's collapse had left the barriers thin enough to slip through. It had taken time. Patience. But time and patience were things he had in abundance. The Slayer scanned the alley, recognized it. Earth, Manhattan, the city he'd helped save without ever speaking to its people. Mission complete. Time to leave. He started walking toward the street. But something made him pause. A presence. Small, weak, but familiar in a way that made his instincts flare. A demon, lesser spawn, barely formed. It squeezed through the same tear he'd used, drawn by the residual energy. drawn by something else. The demon's malformed head turned toward him, sensing the Slayer's hand moved. Super shotgun. One shot. The demon dissolved into ash before it could make a sound. The Slayer lowered the weapon and looked down at his chest. Where the anchor sigil had been, there was now a new mark. Not glowing, not magical, just a burn pattern etched into the armor's surface. A scar of its own. He understood immediately. The sigil had done more than let him touch Hell's contracts. It had marked him. Left a signature that would attract lesser demons like moths to flame, but only near the weak points, the scars where the barriers were thin. Not a curse. Not exactly. Just a consequence. The Slayer considered this for exactly 3 seconds, then dismissed it. Lesser demons were barely an inconvenience, and if they came to him, it saved time hunting them down. Efficient. He holstered the shotgun and stepped out of the alley into the morning light. The street was busy, people moving, cars honking, the city carrying on. No one noticed the armored figure emerging from the shadows. No one saw him walk past a ghost in green and gray. The Slayer moved through the crowd like water through stone. Silent, purposeful, already scanning for the next scar zone, the next weak point. Because that's what he was. What he'd always been. A variable. A consequence. A solution to problems that couldn't be negotiated or reasoned with. And as long as Hell left scars on the world, he would be there to clean up what crawled through. He turned a corner and vanished into the city. Behind him in the alley, the tear pulsed once more. Faint. Almost imperceptible. But not quite closed. And somewhere deep in the gray void between worlds, something that had been watching the Slayer's path took note, marked the route he'd used, and began slowly to follow.